Good evening and welcome from New Canaan Library. I'm Anthony Maricola, Manager of Adult Services and Programming. I hope everybody's doing well. We have a great program for you this evening. Tonight, photojournalist and fine art photographer Claire Thomas will discuss her career as a photojournalist, covering political and military conflicts, human rights, and humanitarian and environmental crises, to give us a first-hand account at what it's like to be a journalist behind the camera. Claire Thomas is a photojournalist and fine art photographer from Wales, currently based in the UK and New York City. A graduate of politics from the University of West of England, Claire has covered a range of stories in various countries, contributing images and photo essays to leading newspapers, magazines, and news agencies worldwide. Tonight, we are very happy to have her with us. Welcome, Claire.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for the opportunity to share my work with you. All right. So, thank you again for this opportunity. It's great to share some of my work with you and talk about some of the stories that I've covered over the course of my career. And yes, much of my work over the last few years has focused on political and military conflicts in the Middle East, mostly in Iraq. I'll start this presentation with a short anecdote from the front line in the battle against ISIS in Mosul in the city of Iraq. So, and sorry, I forgot to mention that before I begin, I should just say that some of the images are a little graphic and they could be upsetting. So viewer discretion. So this image shows a little girl who was brought into a makeshift field clinic in Mosul during the battle against ISIS. And she was brought in with multiple gunshot wounds, a bowel evisceration, and multiple injuries that put her at the very edge of survival. Well, she was injured whilst she was escaping across the front line to the clinic. And within seconds of arriving at the clinic, this paramedic, Katie Batruni from Australia, she dressed her wounds and trying to stem the bleeding to buy the little girl some time to reach a hospital. This was taken like in the middle of a mass casualty incident. It was just chaos. It was very intense. There were bodies everywhere. The medics were overwhelmed. There wasn't enough resources. It was just madness. And so as Katie was carrying the child out into the streets in search of an ambulance, I could see that she was alone. There weren't any other medics with her. So I decided in that moment to put my camera down and accompany her in the ambulance, hoping that, you know, I could offer my support or help in some way. And then, sorry, I skipped one mistake. So as we were in the ambulance, there's no gurney or anything, no supplies. And so Katie had to improvise. And in that moment, the little girl stopped breathing. So Katie placed her onto my lap and she instructed me to hold her still whilst she then inserted a needle into her chest, allowing air back into her collapsed lung. And I'll just never forget this moment, you know, holding this little girl on my blood-soaked lap, with her terrified eyes locked onto mine. And I just thought to myself, like, how on earth did we get here? You know, two of us, two women from very, very far away, how did we end up in the middle of this conflict? Sadly, we don't know what happened to the little girl. By the time we reached the hospital, the medics were waiting, doctors were ready to operate. Of course, I hope she survived, but Katie was needed back at the clinic, the ambulance was needed, so back we went. But this was just a moment that had a very profound impact on me in my career, and it was a moment where it's etched into my memory forever, even though I didn't take photos of that time. But I'll never forget the little girl. On a lighter note, I will go back to the beginning of my journey into photography and photojournalism and how I went from a small village in Wales to the front line in the battle against ISIS in Iraq. So, all right, so I grew up in a tiny village in Wales, surrounded by nature, riding horses, and it was in fact my love of horses that sparked my interest in photography. Sorry, somebody's ringing the doorbell, typical. So anyway, yes, so I just fell in love with photography through photographing horses, basically. While I was at university in England, I had the chance to work as a cowgirl on a ranch in the mountains of Wyoming in the USA. And it was there that I felt inspired to pick up a camera, trying to capture images of these beautiful horses. I mean, it was magical. And, you know, the backdrop of the imposing, vast Wyoming wilderness. So yeah, it was quite a special time. Yeah, this was just like living out my childhood fantasy, really, of being, you know, a cowgirl in a culture and setting that I really thought only existed in Western movies. So this was kind of the beginning of my journey into photography. Sorry, 1 second. So here we go. It just blew my mind. And when I look back, I realized that the time that I spent in Wyoming actually helped prepare me in some ways for the physical demands of working in a war zone. It was quite tough, even though I'd grown up riding horses. I wasn't used to ranch life, let's say, and taking care of 90 horses and just countless hours in the saddle, navigating vast deserts. And so like when I look back, I just think it helped me in some ways for the physical demands. So after a few years of traveling and just taking pictures, developing my skills, my interest, my approach to photography started to change during a volunteer project in Ghana. I went there as a 20-something graduate to take part in a volunteer project with a community-based organization that supports women living with HIV/AIDS. And while I was there, although I wasn't there doing anything related to photography, of course I had my camera. You know, by then I was really into it. I had my first DSLR, and I was just learning all the time about photography and trying to find my niche and understanding more about visual storytelling. So as part of the work I did with the organization, I photographed the women that they support. And I then discovered that I could use these pictures to try and raise awareness of the circumstances of the situation. And I also I decided to set up my own campaign to try and support the women in a small way. And I set up a campaign to raise money to buy mattresses, beds, you know, just simple mattresses for the women. That was something they all told me they didn't have. And this picture of a woman called Rose seemed to resonate quite well with people, and I was able to raise the funds quite quickly. Of course, it was a modest amount, but it enabled me to buy mattresses for 70 women in Ghana. And then after I had raised the funds, I went back and documented the distribution of the mattresses. And this is Rose in her home afterwards. So this was kind of a turning point for me too, because I started to realize that I was really interested in the storytelling aspect of photography and telling people's stories. So yeah, this was an important time. Still, I knew that I wanted to do photography full time, but I didn't know how to turn my new passion into a profession. Oh, this was a beautiful woman. This was such a sad case. We delivered her mattress. Her name was Ali Matu, but she died just a few months after we delivered it. Moving on to Egypt. So there's a reason I included these images, because my unexpected turning point as a photographer came during this trip to Egypt. I think this was in 2015. Can't remember the year exactly. It might have been. Anyway, and whilst I was there traveling, exploring, I captured this image of the camel, and it was later published in National Geographic magazine, and that was the push that I needed to jump in and to start doing photography full time. So that was really a turning point in my career. From there, I then decided that, you know, I studied politics at university. And so I think since then, I'd always felt that I wanted to try and see for myself the realities on the ground for the people affected by the conflicts and policies I'd studied. So I knew I wanted to be a photojournalist, and, you know, I discovered that there's no real roadmap to success as a freelance photojournalist. I just had to kind of find my way as I went along. And I decided that my first assignment would be in Israel and Palestine. So I went there and I started to produce photo essays about daily life for Palestinians living in the West Bank. I wanted to document like just what daily life was like, what are their experiences, what are their struggles, you know, living under military occupation, what that looked like. And so, you know, I spent a lot of time living in the West Bank, and I got to see a lot, and it was quite a surprising time for me. And I wanted to focus especially on the experience of children and their, you know, their struggles with the Israeli soldiers, with checkpoints, tear gas. My goodness, the tear gas was a lot. So this was kind of my first real body of work where I was producing these photo essays as a freelancer and then selling them to news outlets afterwards. I think this is probably my favorite picture of that project, and it just shows this little boy who was, I saw him and his friends riding their bicycle through the old city of Hebron, and he was then detained by soldiers, and he hadn't committed any crime, but he just looked so afraid in this picture, I think, and he was then detained and his bike was taken away. So from Palestine, I then went back to Europe to cover the ongoing refugee crisis and the widespread humanitarian implications of the crisis for, you know, thousands and thousands of people who were seeking safety on European shores. This was in Greece. My God, I struggle to remember some of these now, but this was on the island of Lesbos in Greece. And these are people being rescued after crossing the Aegean Sea from Turkey. And I also spent some time in the jungle in Calais, where, you know, thousands of people were stranded for months on end in cramped conditions, limited access to resources, lack of information. One of the things that surprised me the most there when I walked around and spoke to people was that they would almost all ask me when they would be able to travel to the UK. And, you know, of course, it's a dead end. They weren't able to go to the UK. The only way they could do it was to jump onto trucks and risk their lives in doing so. But on the other side, I had a great time meeting these fascinating people. These were a big group of Afghan guys who I got to know and spend time with. Of course, tensions were high and clashes often broke out between refugees and French authorities, especially when they started to try and close the camp. I can't remember the date, but the French authorities decided that the jungle had to be closed. So they started to clear it. They were moving the makeshift homes away from the highway. And then there was clashes, you know, tear gas and rocks being thrown, things like that. And eventually everybody had to leave. And they, you know, at the beginning, these people were trying to move their home away to a different area, but eventually it was completely cleared and everybody was taken to other centers. Some were relieved to be going somewhere with better resources, better facilities. Others were sad to leave because at least in the jungle they had, I'm not sure if I explained that the jungle is an unofficial refugee camp. At least they had some autonomy. They weren't trapped inside. It wasn't like a gated camp. They could come and go freely. And the same thing on the northern border of Greece. Clashes there also were common when the border between Greece and Macedonia was closed. And that, again, was blocking off access to Western Europe via the Balkan routes and trapping thousands of refugees in northern Greece. There's more tear gas, which has a very bad impact on people. It was quite scary. And oh gosh, this day was awful. This is one of the most harrowing things I've seen, actually, because the tear gas was really, really poisonous and difficult to deal with. And when the Macedonian police were firing it, the wind blew it over where all the guys were trying to push the fence down, and it blew into the tents where all the women and children were staying. So that was a really hard day for them. Of course, there were many moments of humanity and compassion. It's not all bad. Like this guy, this was a rescue worker shaking the hand of a refugee who'd just been rescued off the coast of Greece. And in the camps, I met a lot of Kurdish and Iraqi families who had fled from ISIS. And I think it was this family in particular. They now live in the UK, so I've been in touch with them, and I had the opportunity to go and visit them there. And I'll never forget visiting them in Birmingham shortly after they'd reached there. And they're from Kurdistan, and I think it's partly because of them that I decided to go to Iraq the first time I went. I think I was very interested to find out more about what was causing so many people to flee these areas of conflict, and take such enormous risks to reach Europe and leave everything behind. It's hard to imagine. And so I think that's what made me want to go to Iraq. And then eventually in December 2016, I first went to northern Iraq. I knew that the military operation was underway. ISIS had control of most of northern Iraq and Syria, and the battle had started to liberate the city of Mosul. So I went to Erbil, which is the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, and it's an entry point to Mosul. It's only like an hour from East Mosul. And what was initially a 2-week trip ended up being almost 3 years. It got under my skin, I guess. I felt invested in the story. I fell in love with the people, the country. Despite its troubles, Iraq is a phenomenal place. And now I'm actually working on a story to show another side of the country, but more on that later. So when I first went, I focused primarily on the humanitarian crisis of the people who had been displaced from Mosul. And they were, again, just leaving everything behind. So this was close to the battle lines, but I wasn't right in the middle of the fighting in the beginning. I just wanted to get a feel for the context, what was going on on the periphery. And so I was visiting camps for internally displaced people, again, with just very difficult conditions. But at least in Iraq, they had hope of returning to Mosul after the battle ended. And then one of the biggest stories, I guess, I did in the first few months in Iraq was about the oil wildfires, which was visually fascinating. I'd never seen anything like it. So this was south of Mosul, a town called Qayara, and ISIS had set ablaze 19 oil wells. And so as we drove towards the town, the whole area became blanketed in this vast black sky. It was just so dark. It really gave the area like an apocalyptic feel. And so I captured a series of images of the flames and the firefighters. And this was fascinating for me because my father was in the fire service. So he was able to give me a bit of an insight into what it takes to extinguish a fire of an oil well. And I hadn't really thought about that, but of course it's extremely complicated. It took months and months. I think they brought teams of mechanics, engineers, oil experts, all kinds of things. It was a huge team effort. They brought them from all over the country to take part in the effort. One of the great things as a journalist or as a photographer in Iraq is that you get very good, well, generally speaking, we could have very good access. I mean, it was quite extraordinary to be able to get this close to the actual fires. And as you can see here, the firefighters standing right on the edge of the abyss, taking a selfie. So they were, I mean, they're used to it. As long as the wind was blowing away, it was fine. But yeah, this was an extraordinary story, and deeply tragic because, of course, even though they were successful in eventually extinguishing the flames, the toxic gases, everything. There's so much poison that it had a lasting and devastating effect on the land, on the, you know, the whole area. And a lot of people were suffering from respiratory illnesses after that for months, if not years afterwards. Yeah, it was just amazing to see it at nighttime. And then in the same area, we went from the fires to, we joined a local militia unit that was fighting ISIS in villages in the desert near the town. So we joined them, which kind of involved going from house to house, taking cover from ISIS sniper fire. And I think this was just the most intense day I've ever had working in a conflict zone. So many close calls in one day. I, at one point, was standing behind this house, taking a break. There seemed to be a pause in the fighting. All the soldiers were relaxed, laughing, chatting. I was sitting down on the ground with the others, and some of the soldiers asked me if they could take a selfie. So I stood up, and they, I mean, I had a translator, but like they were just gesturing that they wanted a photo. So I said, okay. I stood up, they took my helmet off, and I immediately felt a bullet whizzing past my ear. So that was a bit of a scary moment. And then, of course, the soldiers just burst out laughing, and I was very confused. And they said that, well, if you hear it, it means you're not dead. So it's a good day. So yeah, these were a unit of militias working with the Iraqi security forces. And, you know, during the first few months, I think, of my time in Iraq, I focused mostly on the military efforts, like the mechanics of war, the military's advance into the city of Mosul. And then I started to realize that I wasn't getting the whole picture. Yeah, like I was missing the most important part of the story for me, which was the human cost of the conflict. So I was trying to find a way to get a more intimate perspective of the experience of the civilians, you know, who were caught up in the conflict. And eventually, in the summer of 2017, I finally managed to have an opportunity to join a team of international medics who I'd heard were working just behind the front line. So they invited me to work with them, documenting their work as the battle entered the old city of Mosul. And I have a short video clip here just to give you an idea of what the old city looked like, I guess, and a little clip from the clinic. So it's just a few seconds. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so just to give you an idea of the clinic and the gunfire, which of course was quite constant, but that gunfire there was actually celebratory gunfire. That was towards the end of the battle. But just to give an idea. And here we are at the clinic. Now, of course, clinic is a bit of a stretch. It's a field clinic. It was very basic. They would set them up inside, you know, abandoned storefronts, whatever they could find, and then they would move forward frequently as Iraqi forces were gaining ground and pushing ISIS back. And so the medics were working alongside. I was with an international team of medics, so they were mostly American. It was run by an American guy, and yeah, the team was international, but they were working with soldiers who were also medics. And then as civilians were escaping across the front line, they would come directly to the clinic for, I mean, all they could do was, emergency pre-hospital care, stabilize them until they could get to a hospital. But they were saving a lot of lives. This is interesting because actually one of the main causes of people coming in to the clinic, if they weren't, if it wasn't a gunshot wound or anything, was heat exhaustion. I can't explain how hot it was, and a lot of these children were just suffering from dehydration and heat exhaustion. It was quite serious. Oh gosh, and this photo is probably the most harrowing photo I took there, because she just has this tearless look of shock and despair, and her injuries weren't life-threatening, at least. There was a lot of this, and yeah, I was just so inspired by these medics. This was a real definitive moment for me, and I felt like my photographs took on a new meaning. At least for me personally, I thought they became really important. I wanted to really document what was happening here, what the medics were doing, tell the story of the survivors as well as the victims, and all of those who risked their lives to save others. And one of the things that I was so shocked by immediately was how malnourished people were. I mean, I knew that the residents of Mosul, had been trapped for months and months in the old city of Mosul, without access to food and water. But it was still just really shocking to see the degree of starvation. And this guy, he was just crying with relief when he finally reached the clinic. I think that was when people started to realize that they were out, they were safe. Oh, I had to share this story. So this guy, when I first saw him in the clinic, I thought he was dead. He was just sitting down, nobody was seeing to him, and I thought, oh my God, this man is dead. And so I was trying to get the medics, but they were so busy, and I felt hopeless that I wasn't able to help, but I didn't know what to do. So I was just trying to get a medic, like, somebody needs to help this guy. And they did, and nobody seemed to be doing anything, and I was kind of surprised. And then I gestured to one of the rescue guys, like, what's happening? And then they whispered something in the old guy's ear, and the next thing I knew, he was sitting up and giving me this sign. It was just such a surreal moment. And then he reached out to me, and he pulled me over, and he said, my dear, I used to be a university professor, and he spoke good English, and he used to teach at the Mosul University, and he had superficial wounds. He was just severely malnourished, but he would be fine. Yeah, and this, I think, is one of the most impactful photographs I captured in Mosul, and it shows the baby, a 2-month-old baby who's severely malnourished, and Katie Batruni, the paramedic from Australia here, there wasn't much she could do other than check that he was okay, and then send him to the hospital with his mother. But yeah, it was really shocking to see a baby in this state. His name was Suleiman. And, as you can imagine, documenting the work of the medics in this environment was an intense and emotionally challenging experience. And it certainly gave me an intimate insight, and definitely an unforgettable insight into, the human cost of conflict, what it's like for people who are caught up in this. And it was a difficult time. I think, I'm trying to remember the statistics. So I think the battle lasted about 9 months in Mosul, and I think it claimed the lives of between 9,000 and 11,000 civilians, according to an AP report. So it took a heavy toll, and of course the whole city was left in ruins. I'm sorry, I had to include a picture of a horse. I mean, even in a war zone, I seem to stumble across horses. Oh, it's shocking. And I wanted to say that, it wasn't all, there were, amongst all of the tragedy, there were these kind of surreal moments of joy, and compassion and support, both with like the other medics, other journalists, soldiers, and particularly the residents of Mosul. I felt so looked after, kind of. There was a family who lived just behind the mosque where we were based, and every night they would insist that we come in and join them for dinner, and they would shower us with kindness and delicious Iraqi food. So yeah, and the soldiers too were always fussing to make sure we were okay, you know, and making sure we had plenty of water because it was so hot. Yeah, the Iraqi soldiers always somehow managed to be cheerful. And this was a moment of joy when a bomb squad was called out to the mosque where we were staying, that 2 IEDs had been found planted outside the 2 entrances. So the bomb disposal team was called out, and this was the mood after they successfully detonated the bombs. And these are soldiers celebrating on the day that victory was declared over ISIS in Mosul. Of course, in reality, the fighting continued, but it was very contained by then. But civilians continued to be injured, and they were still being brought out from the old city. So it didn't quite end on that day. And of course, for the residents of Mosul, the war continues. You know, they're still feeling the impacts of war, so much loss, the destruction of the city. I haven't been back now since 2019, so I hope to go back this year and follow up and see what the city of Mosul looks like now. But this image sort of stands out to me as one of my favorite ones, because I feel like there's something poignant about it. It was the day of liberation, and just the lone soldier walking through the quiet streets. There was like a very eerie silence on that day. The bombing stopped, the gunfire subsided, and there was a quiet calmness, but you know, also a deep sadness. I wanted to come back to this image of baby Suleiman. I think it's such a haunting image. And so 2 years after I took this picture, and just 1 week after I'd left Iraq in 2019, I got a message on Facebook from an Iraqi doctor called Mohammed asking if I'd taken the picture. I said, yeah, I did. And then he went on to explain that he was a doctor at the camp where Suleiman was taken to, and he'd worked tirelessly for months and months to keep the infant alive. Yeah, I was so happy to hear that, and he wanted to tell me that he was doing well, he was alive and doing well. So that was a really special moment. And then I returned to Iraq with the Sunday Times then to meet Mohammed, and he took us to the camp to meet Suleiman with his mother, and here he is 2 years later. But it makes me really sad to say that I just had a message from Mohammed just a few weeks ago to say that there was a tragic accident in the camp, and Suleiman was killed in an accident. So he's no longer with us. So after the battle ended, after victory was declared, of course the country then started the very long road to recovery, rebuilding everything that was lost. And by then mainstream media attention was diverted elsewhere, and most of the reporters and photojournalists left the country. So I decided to stay and try to cover what I think is equally important story of post-conflict recovery and rebuilding. And for the next 2 years, in addition to my photojournalism work, I was contributing as a photography consultant to the United Nations Development Programme in Iraq, which was fascinating. And my task with them was to document the progress and impact of their projects in areas affected by ISIS across Iraq. So yeah, it focused on rebuilding water systems, homes, schools, water treatment plants. I've never been to so many water treatment plants, substations. But more than that, I wanted, they asked me to tell the stories of the people who are benefiting from those programs, from the schools. This lady who's just got the most beautiful face, I think, Layla, I think her name was, and she was employed on one of their cash for work programs, which is temporary work contracts that was empowering women as well as men to take an active role in rebuilding their communities and schools. And so the women had lots of different tasks, and for many of them it was the first time they'd ever had a job, and they seemed to really like it. So this was a school. I think I have the next picture. This was a school in Mosul that was badly damaged, and then yes, this is the photo of after it had been restored. So it just felt very, very meaningful to me to be able to witness firsthand and photograph all of these projects, you know, that were really making an impact. This was a school in Western Anbar that had been restored, and it was just amazing to see the country kind of come back to life. This was a state-of-the-art operating theatre, and I mean, they let me just go in and take photos of all these operations. It was remarkable. She's a midwife. So yeah, this is in Mosul again, part of the cleanup operation. Yeah. They also restored a lot of bridges, because I think all of the bridges going in so Mosul is divided by the Tigris River, and I think all of the bridges were blown up to restrict access. So UNDP was rebuilding most of the bridges, not all of them. All right, that brings us back to some horses, of course. So yeah, this is actually in Iraq, and you know, it doesn't matter where I go in the world, whether it's intentional or not, I always end up around horses. And of course, Iraq was no exception. And yeah, so in Erbil, they had this luxurious international equestrian club. So aside from the conflict, I was able to photograph horse racing events at this club. And yeah, they had the first ever cash betting event in Iraq that took place while I was there. So that was an interesting story. And they had beautiful horses. The standard was quite high, and they also had show jumping events, which was such a juxtaposition from the conflict. It was mind-boggling, and they even let me take part in the show jumping competitions, which I hadn't done since I was a child. So, you know, I feel very, very privileged that my work has taken me to many remote and beautiful and culturally diverse parts of the world. And in 2019, after I left Iraq, I decided to start working on something completely different, start a new project. And that project is an ongoing project, and it kind of draws on my background and affinity with horses. And it's an in-depth look at the relationship and bond between horses and people whose livelihoods depend on them. So to kick off that project, I went to Mongolia in October 2019. And my goal there was to look at the livelihoods, the lifestyles of the iconic Kazakh eagle hunters and horsemen and animal herders of the Altai Mountains of Western Mongolia. So yeah, this made me think about how powerful photography is, because I had wanted to go to Mongolia for years. I think it was a lifelong dream, and the reason I wanted to go is because many years ago I'd seen these kind of photographs somewhere in a magazine of, you know, proud men dressed in animal skins, riding horses, carrying enormous birds of prey, and it just stuck with me. I just wanted to go and see it for myself, and finally the opportunity came up for me to go. And then, you know, my goal there was to try and capture a set of images that offer an authentic and artistic representation of the traditional lifestyles. And all of the families I met in the Altai are semi-nomadic. They're semi-nomadic animal herders, so their livelihoods depend on their animals, whether it's cashmere from the goats, meat from goats and sheep, or horses they breed and train, and also the birds. Of course, the eagles bring some income from people who come to see them in action. And I mean, of course, it was horses that took me to Mongolia. My dream was to go meet these people, learn about their lives, and to ride with them, of course. but the eagles sort of stole the show. They're majestic. I had never had close contact with the eagles before. I had no idea that they would be so big. And what was immediately clear to me was the bond between the hunters and their birds. It was tangible to see their closeness. And I like that. There seemed to be a mutual affection and respect. But I think in the end, what really captured my heart in Mongolia were the families. The people were just phenomenal. It was just such an honor to be able to kind of capture a window into their lives. And, you know, I think this is to me, these kind of projects are quite important because this is a lifestyle that is going to look very different, you know, in years to come. Things are changing quite quickly in Mongolia. More and more families are migrating from rural areas to urban centers. The threat of climate change is affecting I think their livelihoods are becoming more and more unsustainable as things change. And of course, even the families we stayed with, they expressed their wishes for their children to have a different future, to have different opportunities. So yeah, I felt very glad to have the chance to see this traditional way of life. And this woman, Baigan, was my favorite. She reminded me of like a Welsh grandmother, always fussing, making sure everybody has enough food and is warm. And she was just amazing. And I feel like her hands tell a very profound story about her life. She's quite old, but continues to work outdoors in like severe conditions. It's not an easy life. And she's butchering meat outside the family home. And what I loved about being in Mongolia, on top of everything, was that you were never going to be without a cup of hot tea in your hand. And so it kind of reminded me a little bit of home. So I'm looking forward. I returned to Mongolia in July this year, not to the same area. I will be going back to see the families hopefully next year. And I just thought I'd end with a few snaps from my recent exhibition here in New York City, which featured 43 images of the Kazakh families in Mongolia. And it was just such a great opportunity to be able to display these prints in such a beautiful city. And it's just closed. Otherwise I would have loved to invite you all to come and see it. It was in Manhattan, but it just closed. But I did just do a walkthrough video, which I shared on YouTube, and that's available to view via my website on the exhibition webpage. All right, thank you very, very much for your attention, and I'll be glad to answer any questions you have.
Oh, thank you so much, Claire. You know, your body of work is amazing, and your photographs have a sense of empathy, and they really show a respect for your subject. Is getting emotionally attached to subjects unavoidable in your field, or is it something you're able to moderate based on the situation?
Yeah, I think you have to maintain some degree of professional distance. Otherwise, I think it would be too difficult to do the work. Of course, it is, I think it's inevitable to get somewhat emotionally attached, and I'm quite an emotional person, so I don't try to hide my emotions. And I feel like, there were times when I would be crying, but I would still try to shoot. But I think there's a time and a place to process those emotions as well. Like, you have to just try and hold it together, and then talk about it when the time is right, and process it. But I'll never forget being the first time I went to Ghana. I was quite young, and it was the first time I think I'd been exposed to suffering really in quite a deep way. And I remember being quite sad and emotional when I met the women who were just living in extremely difficult circumstances, in poverty, poor health, no support network. And I think I got upset, and my boss, the lady I was working with, was so upset with me, and she was like, you can't do that. You can't add to their problems, basically. You have to be strong, or you're not helping anybody. And I think that kind of stuck with me. So she's like, there's a time and a place. Let's go home and talk about it.
Thank you. How do you prepare for your assignments, especially if you're visiting a country for the first time? I mean, you're spending a significant amount of time with people that you don't know, and oftentimes, you're not sharing a lot of the same cultures or language. How do you prepare for that?
I try to do as much research as possible for sure. And then I would reach out to other journalists and try to get connected with local fixers. Basically, in a conflict zone, we can't do our job without fixers. They're extraordinary people. They make it all possible. And so the fixer is a local person who is like a translator, driver. They give you access to the story. So yeah, I try to connect with other journalists is an excellent resource through, and there are a lot of like journalist resources and networks online where we would ask questions. I think that's how it happened for me in Iraq the first time I went. I posted on some Facebook group, I'm very grateful for Facebook for these things. And I was able to get in touch with a community of freelancers working in Iraq, and that just made all of the difference for me, because then I was welcomed into the community and they were able to share contacts and things like that. Of course, it would be better if I had some Arabic, especially since I work so much in the Middle East, which is something I'm going to work on when I move to Cairo at the end of this month. So I'll definitely be taking some Arabic classes. I really have no excuse not to speak Arabic. I lived in Iraq for long enough that I definitely should. But in my defense, I was living in the Kurdistan region, so I was more exposed to Kurdish than Arabic. But yeah, I definitely need to learn some Arabic.
Over the last decade, there's been an increase of violence against journalists. Can you talk a bit about what it was like to be a female photographer in the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough regardless of gender. I actually, in Iraq, I sometimes felt like being a woman was an advantage. I felt like the locals would really look out for me even more as a woman. I think it's tough no matter what. Of course, there are greater risks in some ways, but I didn't feel that in Iraq. I really felt like, yeah, I didn't feel like being a woman was a hindrance in any way, if I'm honest. It was, I mean, and I think it's different if you're working in more conservative areas, but I mean, Iraqi people are just so warm and so welcoming and protective. And like I said, the families, as a Western woman, I was able to go and have dinner, sit with the men and the women, whereas an Iraqi woman wouldn't necessarily be, it's less culturally accepted in some communities, in the more conservative communities, for a woman to sit with the men at dinner kind of thing. But as a Western woman, they're just like, yeah, come and sit with, and it was just very, very open and welcoming, and they made me feel very good. And as I said, the soldiers too were very respectful. There were times when we were out in the desert in Sinjar with military units, and I would be the only woman with a group of guys. And in those situations, we would all be bunking in together, which you wouldn't normally do, of course. But in that context, it was the only thing that was available. And they were very, very respectful. I felt very safe all the time. The risks, of course, are the same. Sitting on an IED, which is something that did actually happen by accident. Luckily, it was deactivated. But what I'm trying to say is that the risks are enormous, of course, but they're the same for everybody, I think, regardless of gender.
Thank you. Somebody asks, how has what you have seen impacted your sense of what a future family life could be for you? Might you want it or not?
I'm not sure. I think I think I would say that my experiences make me very, very grateful to be from such a peaceful place. And I always felt thankful that I was able to escape at any time. You know, it was my choice to go to Mosul, to go into any active wars. You know, it's my decision as journalists. It's our choice to go. We can leave at any time. So I always felt, you know, I feel it's not like that for obviously the residents who are caught up in the conflict. And yeah, I mean, you know, it does affect you, of course. Seeing horrific things inevitably has an impact. As I said, I'm an open person, so I feel like I was open to talk about it a lot. And like the other medics that I was working with, we were always quite keen to make sure that we were all feeling okay and processing things well and not suppressing our feelings. So and then when I went home at the end of the conflict, I felt surprisingly uncomfortable, because of course when I went to my family, nobody can relate, and it's really hard to talk about what you've seen. So I decided to just go back to Iraq quite quickly afterwards. But yeah, I guess it's made me just want to cherish all the good things and try to focus on being optimistic and grateful for having such a privileged life.
Beautiful answer. So we have a lot of photography enthusiasts in New Canaan, and somebody asks, what equipment do you use?
Good question. I have the best camera in the world. I absolutely love it. I have a Nikon D850, which I just find to be absolutely flawless. I love this camera so much. But while I was in Mosul, I had a D610 Nikon. So I'm pretty keen on Nikon. I did have a Canon for a while, which I couldn't quite get to grips with. So I'm definitely a Nikon woman. And I just have two lenses. I have a 24 to 70 millimeter, which is basically what I use all of the time. And I also have a 70 to 200 for, you know, for longer distances, which I don't use that much. So now I have two D850 camera bodies. And I just actually got my first mirrorless camera, the Z6II Nikon, which I'm trying to get to grips with. I'm definitely not quite there yet.
Thank you. Okay, so as a last question, and we'll end, I guess, on a happier note, are there any suggestions for a young college student studying photography for getting started in the field after college?
Yeah, okay. You know, I think it's one of the most rewarding jobs in the world. And the advice that I got, I mean, I didn't study photography or photojournalism, and I kind of wish I had. I think that gives you a leg up for sure. And one of the most important things I think is to like develop your own visual voice. So, you know, just shoot everything. Go out and just start telling stories with images. Study what the different elements are of a good photo story, ones that you like. And learn how to pitch. Oh my gosh, pitching is the bane of my life. That's the hardest thing, I think, is like, I mean, getting the story is great, and it, you know, it's creative and it's fun and interesting, but then trying to place it and get the attention of editors, I think that's one of the most challenging aspects of the job. So learning to pitch is important, learning the style and type of content of the magazines and publications that you want to pitch to, and just start networking. And like when I started, I actually, one of the most important things I did was I reached out to a Welsh photographer whose work I really admired, and I just asked for some guidance, and he's been my mentor ever since. And he shared with me his list of contacts and has been kind of guiding me and helping me, and still does. So I think it's good to reach out to people whose work you like.
Oh, wonderful. Claire, thank you so much for sharing your evening with us and telling us your story. I wish you the best on your future travels, and I look forward to seeing more of your work. I shared that article in the chat, the New York Times article about the Welsh mountain ponies. And we were talking about it earlier because that's what sparked me to reach out to you, because the photos were so amazing.
Good.
Yeah, but thank you so much. Thank you so much for telling us your story.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Thank you. New Canaan community, thank you for spending your evening with us as well. And we will see you again soon.